Tonight, at some point, you're going to lie in the dark and wait for sleep to arrive in one long, unbroken block. You'll expect 8 hours, straight to finish, no interruption. If you wake up in the middle of the night, you'll probably assume something is wrong with you. Here's the strange part. For most of human history, that expectation would have made no sense at all. The dark hours of your ancestors' lives weren't empty, and they weren't spent unconscious the way you imagine. Night was doing something. It shaped how humans slept, how they bonded, how they told stories, and even how they thought about their own minds. And almost none of it looked like a modern bedroom. Start with the most basic assumption you carry into every night: one sleep, straight through. A historian named Roger E. Kirch spent years combing through court records, diaries, and medical texts from pre-industrial Europe, and he found something that didn't fit the modern pattern at all. People described a first sleep and a second sleep with an hour or more of quiet wakefulness in between. During that middle window, people didn't panic. They didn't reach for anything to knock themselves back out. They prayed. They talked with a partner lying beside them. Some got up to tend a fire, or visit a neighbor, or simply lie in the dark and think. Then, when the body was ready, sleep returned for a second stretch until morning. Kirch traced this pattern back for centuries, and it only started disappearing after cheap, reliable artificial light became widespread. Before that, before your bedside lamp and streetlight and glowing phone screen, biphasic sleep, sleep broken into two segments, appears to have been closer to the human default than the single unbroken block you now consider normal. Some of the language survives even now, buried in old expressions most people no longer question. Phrases about the dead of night and rituals around a midnight watch hint at a period of the dark hours that once had its own name, its own purpose, and its own place in daily life, rather than simply being erased by sleep. But if this was so common in recorded history, what about further back, before writing, before agriculture? For that answer, researchers had to go looking for groups still living without electric light today. A neuroscientist named Jerome Siegel led a study in 2015 that tracked the sleep of 3 modern hunter-gatherers and forager societies: the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of Namibia, and the Chimane of Bolivia. His team fitted people with small wrist monitors, sensors that track movement and rest without needing a single word of language in common, and simply watched what happened night after night for weeks. The results surprised almost everyone who has ever blamed modern insomnia on modern stress. These groups slept, on average, less than 7 hours a night, not the 8 or 9 hours often imagined for a supposedly natural pre-industrial life. They rarely mapped during the day, and critically, almost none of them showed the segmented 2-part sleep pattern Kirch had documented in early modern Europe. Instead, something else stood out. Body temperature, not darkness itself, seemed to govern when they fell asleep. People tended to drift off as the temperature dropped after sunset and wake as it began rising again before dawn. Darkness set the stage, but the body's internal thermostat conducted the performance. So the 2-part sleep pattern wasn't some universal ancient default. It may have been something that emerged later, in denser, colder, differently structured societies, closer to Kirch's candlelit villages than to the open, temperature-driven rhythms of small foraging bands under an open sky. But what both groups shared, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, was this: night was rarely just sleep, it was a social space. Consider what actually happens around a fire once the sun goes down and the day's work is finished. You can't dig for tubers in the dark. You can't easily track animals or gather firewood once visibility drops. The tasks that filled daylight hours simply stop being possible. What replaces them is talk. An anthropologist named Polly Weissner spent time recording nighttime and daytime conversations among the Juhansi San, comparing what people talked about after dark versus during the day. Daytime conversation, she found, leaned heavily on economics and complaint, who owed what, who had slighted whom, disputes over resources and behavior. It was the practical business of living together. Firelight conversation was different. It shifted toward story. People told long, layered narratives about distant relatives, about ancestors, about the movements of animals and the history of their land. These weren't idle tales. They carried information about the wider social network, about who was related to whom across great distances, about where resources could be found in lean seasons, about the values that held a small group together when nobody was watching. Firelight itself seems to change how people behave. Something about dim, flickering light without the sharp visual cues of daylight appears to soften posture and lower social tension. People argue less, they laugh more. The same words carry differently when the only light in the world comes from a source everyone is quietly sharing. Faces are harder to read in firelight, expressions blur into shadow, and that softening may be exactly what makes people more willing to open up, to admit uncertainty, to tell a story they'd never bring up under the harsher scrutiny of daylight. That's not a coincidence built for comfort. It's likely a survival mechanism with a very old function. A group that shares stories about kinship and cooperation at night is a group better equipped to call on distant allies during a drought, a group whose children grow up already knowing the invisible web of relationships that could someday save their lives. Night, in other words, wasn't downtime carved out of a more important day. It may have been doing some of the most important cultural work humans ever did. Work that daylight, filled with the noise of survival tasks, simply had no room for. Not every night looked the same either. The moon changed everything. A bright full moon can provide enough light to move safely, gather a little food, or extend a conversation well past the point darkness normally force everyone toward sleep. Researchers studying the Hadza found that people shifted their sleep timing by roughly 10 to 20 minutes depending on the lunar cycle, going to bed later and waking later around the full moon, then drifting earlier again as the nights grew darker. It's a small shift, but a telling one. It suggests the human body wasn't simply reacting to a fixed clock. It was reading the actual sky, adjusting itself to how much usable light the night offered, in a way almost no modern bedroom, sealed off behind curtains and screens, ever asks it to anymore. Before electric light flattened every night into the same manageable darkness, the moon effectively gave humans a second, dimmer sun, roughly twice a month, and the body seemed to have noticed. There was danger in it too, and that danger shaped behavior just as powerfully as the storytelling did. Predators that hunt by night and rival groups that might raid under cover of darkness made the hours after sunset genuinely risky for early humans. Large cats in particular are built for low-light hunting ways humans simply are not, with better night vision, quieter movement, and an ambush strategy that favors darkness. A human on open ground after sunset was operating at a serious sensory disadvantage, unable to see nearly as far or as clearly as the animals most likely to see him first. Fire wasn't only for warmth and cooking, it was a boundary. Most large predators avoid open flame instinctively, and a burning fire at the edge of a camp created a rough perimeter that daylight never required.
Archaeological evidence of controlled fire use stretches back hundreds of thousands of years, and its role as a nightly defense line was likely just as important as its role in preparing food. This may explain something else anthropologists have long noticed in accounts of small-scale societies: the presence of a night watch, an informal rotation where at least one member of the group stayed alert while others slept. Someone was almost always at least partially awake, tending the fire, listening for movement beyond the firelight's reach, ready to raise the alarm before the rest of the group ever opened their eyes. That middle-of-the-night wakefulness Ekirch documented in European villages, the quiet hour between first and second sleep, may echo a much older pattern, one where the human body never fully committed to 8 straight hours of vulnerability, because for most of its
evolutionary history, that vulnerability could be fatal. You can still feel a faint trace of this today. Sleep researchers have long observed something called first night effect, where people sleep more lightly and wake more easily during their first night in an unfamiliar place. One half of the brain, quite literally, stays slightly more alert than the other, almost as though part of you is still standing watch, checking an unfamiliar tree line for movement long after the conscious decision to relax has been made. Your ancestors didn't experience night as a single uniform block of unconsciousness. It had structure, danger, ritual, and rhythm. It was punctuated by watchfulness, softened by firelight, timed to the moon, and used deliberately for the kind of bonding that daylight's practical demands crowded out. Now think about your own night again: the lamp beside your bed, the blue glow of a screen an hour before sleep, the expectation that 8 uninterrupted hours is not just normal but mandatory, and anything else is a problem to be fixed. You sleep in a room sealed against moonlight, temperature controlled against the seasons, with nothing outside the window that requires a watch. Some of what you call insomnia, that unwelcome wakefulness at 3 in the morning, might not be a malfunction at all. It might be an old rhythm reasserting itself in a world that no longer has any fire to gather around, no watch to take, no story waiting to be told in the dark. Your body is still, in its own quiet way, listening for something the modern night no longer offers. Tonight, when you wake for a few minutes in the middle of the night, you won't have anyone to talk to by firelight, and no distant tree line worth watching. But for a few thousand generations before you, someone did, almost every single night, and the rhythm they lived by is still quietly running somewhere underneath yours.